Some places don't forget what happened on their soil. Long after the screams fade and the blood dries, the past waits, breathing in the dark. On a remote Alabama plantation, an act of cruelty planted a seed of revenge so powerful that it followed one man beyond daylight, beyond reason, and possibly beyond death itself. The overseer's authority was absolute, granted not by law alone, but by fear, carefully cultivated over years. On the Alabama plantation, his presence altered the air itself. Conversations died when his boots struck the dirt road, and backs stiffened long before his voice carried across the fields. He was not born into wealth or title. His power came from enforcement, from proving daily that he could bend bodies and wills alike. He kept meticulous records of quotas and punishments, treating human lives as numbers to be managed. To the plantation owner, he was efficient and loyal. To those beneath him, he was an ever-present threat, unpredictable and watching, his approval as rare as mercy itself. Cruelty, for him, was not merely a tool, but a language. He believed pain corrected disobedience and humiliation prevented resistance. Public punishment was his favorite method, staged carefully so others would learn without needing to test him. He understood the psychology of terror, how waiting could be worse than the blow itself. Sometimes he delayed punishment for days, letting rumors spread and fear ferment. At other times he acted swiftly, violently, as if to remind everyone that restraint was a choice he could abandon at any moment. He never raised his voice unless necessary, which made his calm commands far more frightening than rage ever could. At night, when the fields emptied and the quarters fell into uneasy rest, the overseer did not soften. He walked the grounds with a lantern, inspecting locks, listening for whispers, convincing himself that vigilance was the same as control. He distrusted silence, interpreting it as plotting rather than exhaustion. Any sign of humanity among the enslaved, laughter, song, shared grief, was treated as defiance. He believed connection bred rebellion, so he worked tirelessly to fracture it. Families were separated for minor offenses, and friendships were punished as conspiracies. In his mind, isolation ensured obedience, and obedience justified everything he did. What made him especially dangerous was his certainty. He never questioned his role or methods, never considered himself cruel. He spoke of order, discipline, and necessity, repeating the same justifications used by generations before him. To him, suffering was incidental, an unfortunate byproduct of maintaining productivity. He convinced himself that the plantation would collapse without his harsh guidance, that leniency would invite chaos. This belief insulated him from guilt, allowing him to sleep after days soaked in others' misery. Yet even then, there were moments when his eyes lingered too long on the faces he disciplined, as if something unspoken pressed back against his certainty. Over time, the plantation became an extension of his will, every fence post and pathway reflecting his need for dominance. The land absorbed his routines, the crack of leather, the measured steps, the calculated cruelty repeated day after day. Those forced to endure him began to see him less as a man and more as a force, something to be survived rather than confronted. But power built on fear is fragile, dependent on silence and submission. Beneath the surface of his carefully maintained order, resentment grew quietly, patiently, shaped by memory and pain, waiting for a moment when authority would falter just enough for something irreversible to take root. The spark of revenge did not arrive as a sudden act of violence, but as a moment of unbearable clarity. It began with a single incident, small in the overseer's eyes, routine even, yet devastating in its consequence. A punishment meant to demonstrate control crossed into something far worse, something personal. It stripped away the last illusion of restraint and revealed the overseer's authority for what it truly was, unchecked and merciless. Those who witnessed it understood immediately that a boundary had been shattered. What had once been endured in silence now burned itself into memory, not as fear alone, but as a wound that refused to close. For the one who would later become the source of revenge, this moment rearranged the world. Pain was only part of it. Humiliation and loss cut deeper. The plantation had always been a place of suffering, but now it became a place of purpose. Every sound, the wind through the fields, the chains at night, the distant footsteps, seemed to echo the same message. Survival was no longer enough. Something inside hardened, reshaping grief into resolve. Among the enslaved, stories were often shared quietly, passed down like warnings, but this experience was not meant to be told. It was meant to be carried, internalized, and transformed into something the overseer could never anticipate. Revenge on a plantation could not be loud or immediate. Open defiance meant death, so it had to grow in secret, nourished by patience and observation. The overseer's habits became predictable to those forced to live under him. His routes, his moods, the times when his guard slipped just enough to expose vulnerability. What he believed was invisibility was, in truth, arrogance. Every act of cruelty taught lessons he never intended to give. He showed where power came from and, more importantly, where it could be disrupted. The spark smoldered quietly, hidden behind lowered eyes and obedient silence. There were whispers that night held more freedom than day, that darkness listened when people could not speak. Some believed the ancestors watched, others believed the land itself remembered. Whether these beliefs were spiritual, psychological, or born from desperation no longer mattered. The spark of revenge fed on them all. It drew strength from collective pain, from generations who had been denied justice. What formed was not just anger aimed at one man, but a force shaped by everything he represented. The overseer became a symbol, and symbols are far more dangerous than individuals. When the moment finally came, it did not look like rebellion. There were no raised voices, no sudden chaos, no immediate satisfaction. It unfolded subtly, almost invisibly, the way rot spreads beneath a polished surface. A decision was made that could not be undone, setting events in motion that would follow the overseer beyond the plantation's borders and into the private corners of his mind. What began as a single act of cruelty had now awakened something far older and far more patient, something that did not seek justice in the way men understood it, but balance, remembrance, and a reckoning that would unfold slowly, deliberately, and without mercy. After the spark was lit, the plantation changed in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to ignore. The fields looked the same in daylight, the routines continued, and the overseer still walked with the same rigid authority, yet something unseen had settled into the space between people. Whispers began to travel in fragments, never spoken fully, never directed at one person for too long. They moved like breath through the quarters, carrying hints of omens and warnings. Some spoke of shadows that lingered after sunset, others of sounds that did not belong to the night. These murmurs were not meant to incite panic, but to acknowledge a shift, an understanding that the balance of power had begun to tilt. Among the enslaved, storytelling had always been a means of survival, a way to preserve memory and meaning when everything else could be taken away. Now those stories took on a sharper edge. Old folk tales were repeated with new emphasis, their symbols aligning too closely with recent events to feel accidental. Spirits who punished the cruel, restless souls bound to places of suffering, land that rejected injustice. These ideas circulated quietly, reinforcing a shared belief that the overseer's actions had consequences beyond human law. Whether these tales were literal truths or psychological armor mattered less than the effect they produced. Fear no longer belonged solely to one side. The overseer began to sense the change without understanding it. Laughter seemed to stop when he approached, not with the usual panic but with something colder, more deliberate. He noticed glances exchanged behind his back, brief and unreadable. He dismissed them as insolence, yet they unsettled him in ways defiance never had. At night, his patrols felt longer, the darkness thicker, as though the lantern's light could no longer push it away. Sounds carried strangely across the fields, footsteps echoing where no one stood, whispers dissolving when he turned to face them. He told himself it was imagination, but repetition gave those moments weight. The plantation itself seemed to participate in the whispers. The wind through the cotton no longer sounded uniform. It rose and fell unevenly, mimicking breath. Floorboards creaked in empty buildings, and doors shifted without reason. Animals grew skittish, refusing certain paths after dusk. These were small things, easily explained in isolation, but together they created an atmosphere of watchfulness. Those who lived and worked there felt observed by something older than the overseer, something that had seen many such men come and go. The land, soaked in years of suffering, carried memory the way scars carry pain. As the whispers deepened, they became a form of resistance the overseer could not punish. He could strike bodies, separate families, increase patrols, but he could not lash a rumor or confine a belief. Fear, once his most reliable weapon, began to fracture and reflect back toward him. The enslaved learned to endure his presence with a quiet steadiness that unnerved him more than rebellion ever could. Every unexplained sound, every sudden silence, fed the sense that he was no longer in control of the narrative. that something unseen was threading through the plantation, binding people together through shared knowledge and anticipation, waiting patiently for the moment when whispers would no longer need to remain in the dark. The overseer's mind began to betray him in small, almost laughable ways before the true damage became impossible to hide. He misplaced items he had handled moments earlier, forgot instructions he had given with certainty, and found himself rereading the same ledger entries as if the numbers refused to settle. At first he blamed exhaustion, the heat, the strain of maintaining order, yet the errors multiplied, each one carrying a sharp edge of irritation that lingered long after it should have passed. Control had always been his refuge, and the slightest crack in it felt like a personal threat, something pressing against his skull from the inside. Sleep offered no escape. Nights became fragmented, broken into shallow intervals punctured by dreams that felt more like intrusions than rest. He saw the plantation in distorted fragments, fields stretching endlessly, faces without names, footsteps approaching from behind but never arriving. He woke, drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced that someone had been standing over him. The silence afterward was heavy, almost accusatory. He began leaving lamps lit until dawn, pacing his room, listening to the night as if it was speaking in a language he was close to understanding but not yet able to interpret. During the day, paranoia crept into his routines. He studied the enslaved workers not just for disobedience but for signs of knowledge, as though they carried secrets written into their expressions. Innocent glances felt loaded, murmured conversations sounded deliberate. Laughter seemed staged to mock him. He responded with harsher discipline, believing firmness would restore the familiar hierarchy. Instead, it only deepened his isolation. Orders were followed precisely, but without fear, without hesitation, and that absence unsettled him more than resistance ever had. He began to feel like a man shouting commands into an empty space, waiting for an echo that never returned. The boundary between imagination and perception thinned further with each passing week. He heard his name spoken when no one was nearby, footsteps matching his own pace in empty corridors, breathing that did not belong to him. Mirrors became objects of discomfort, reflecting a version of himself that looked slightly wrong, eyes lingering too long, expression unfamiliar. He avoided certain paths at night, unable to explain why his body resisted them. Even in daylight, shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, clinging to him, refusing to separate no matter how directly he faced the sun. As his mind unraveled, the overseer clung desperately to the belief that he was being tested, that endurance would restore order. He refused to admit fear, even to himself, reframing it as vigilance, necessity, responsibility. Yet beneath those rationalizations, something else stirred, an awareness that his authority no longer shielded him from consequence. The plantation had become a closed world, with him trapped at its center, watched by eyes he could not see, haunted not by a single act or person, but by the accumulation of everything he had done, each memory pressing inward, tightening, reshaping his thoughts until there was no clear distinction between punishment and perception, reality and reckoning. The overseer eventually left the plantation, though no one could say with certainty whether it was by choice or necessity. Some claimed he resigned abruptly, others whispered that he was dismissed after becoming unstable, his authority eroded beyond usefulness. What was known was that his departure brought no sense of release. The land remained heavy, as if it had absorbed too much to be cleansed by a single absence. Those who stayed felt the same watchful presence at dusk, the same unease drifting through the fields. The revenge that had been set in motion did not require proximity to continue its work. Away from the plantation, the overseer attempted to reconstruct his life, but the patterns of fear followed him with remarkable consistency. He moved from place to place, never settling long, convinced that familiarity invited exposure. Ordinary sounds unsettled him: the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the rhythm of footsteps behind him on empty streets. He avoided mirrors, avoided silence, avoided sleep when he could. People who encountered him noticed his guarded demeanor, the way his attention flicked constantly toward shadows and corners, as though expecting something to emerge at any moment. His dreams grew more vivid as time passed, not fading with distance but sharpening. He saw the plantation exactly as it had been, yet altered in subtle, unsettling ways. Paths led nowhere, buildings stood where none had before, and the fields seemed to breathe. Faces appeared in the margins of these dreams, watching without expression, never speaking. He woke with the certainty that these visions were not memories, but visitations, reminders that leaving a place did not mean leaving its consequences behind. The past did not pursue him loudly, it waited, confident that he would never truly escape. Stories about the overseer circulated long after he disappeared from public view. Some said he was found wandering at night, muttering to himself, unable to explain where he had been or where he was going. Others believed he died alone, consumed by fear rather than age or illness. On the plantation, new overseers came and went, yet none lasted long. Accidents occurred without clear cause. Tempers flared unexpectedly, and an unspoken understanding settled over the land that certain behaviors invited retribution. The story of what happened there was never written down, only passed quietly, preserved through warning rather than detail. What endured most was the sense that the plantation remembered everything. The revenge did not conclude with a single act or a single life unraveling. It became part of the land's narrative, woven into the soil and the stories told after dark. Those who listened carefully understood that the haunting was not about ghosts in the traditional sense, but about consequence without expiration. The overseer's suffering was not an ending, nor was it a beginning, but a continuation of a cycle shaped by cruelty and answered by something patient and unyielding, ensuring that no act of inhumanity ever truly vanished, no matter how far one tried to run.